Thordar, and I'm very excited to be chairing this panel that focuses on a topic that is extremely close to my heart: diversity and inclusion. Now, the need for diversity within the workplace has definitely gathered momentum over the last few years, often driven by social movements that have reacted to specific events such as Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movements. But as those of us who have fought for equality for a really long time know, it is often 2 steps forward and 1 step back in the fight for equality. But here's hoping that is changing, and increased regulations around social capital as part of any ESG compliance could also be a catalyst for quicker progress. Regressive ways of looking at diversity are also being challenged. It is no longer enough for companies to hire people from diverse backgrounds. They actually have to start listening to those people and work much harder on inclusivity. We will touch on all of these areas with a brilliant panel we have assembled that will give insights into many sectors. So I'm going to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves to begin with, starting with Serpil.
Hello, Inga. It's a pleasure to be in this panel. I am currently the CEO of the Europe cluster for Vodafone Group, and I'm also a member of the group's executive committee. And my passion is also about diversity and inclusion. And therefore, I have been chairing the Inclusion for All SteerCo globally for Vodafone Group since 2013.
Magda?
Hi, I'm Magda Robalo. I'm the Global Managing Director for Women in Global Health. I also sit on the board of the Global Fund and the Vice Chair. I'm the Vice Chair of the Ethics and Governance Committee of the Global Fund. Delighted to be here. Diversity, inclusion, and gender equity are near and close to my heart.
Hi, I'm Lisa Edwards. I'm President and COO of Diligent Corporation, and I am a member of the Board of Directors of Colgate-Palmolive.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. I'm Aubrey Blanche. I'm the Senior Director of Equitable Design at CultureAmp, as well as the CEO of the Mathpath, which is an equitable design firm.
Wonderful. Welcome all. This is going to be a brilliant conversation. I kind of want to start with a fairly open-ended sort of question. And maybe, Serpil, if I could come to you first on this one. I mean, there is an increased focus on compliance, especially around sort of ESG at the moment. But I think it's fair to say that the E has gotten a lot more attention than the S up until now. But I mean, this is changing. What do you think companies need to do to change and become truly diverse and inclusive?
It is true that ESG has been getting an increasing importance in the board and also in the executive agenda of many companies. And I really see that as a very positive movement. And I think the companies have a fundamental responsibility in terms of accelerating diversity and inclusion by working across the industries and collaborating with all the stakeholders. I think many companies by now have been doing a lot of internal policies and internal activities to accelerate the momentum. But my view is that now we need to really step this up by collaborating and joining forces so that we can achieve the outcomes faster by working towards this common purpose.
And I mean, you mentioned the board and its importance. I mean, Lisa, you sit on a board. Just how important is the role of the board that they are absolutely pushing for the social capitals of companies to be, raised?
Well, I think it's very important. And I think it's, the board is not managing the company, but the board is asking the questions. The board is tracking the metrics. The board is, concerned with reputational issues. So asking the right questions of the management team on how are you handling this? What are you doing to create a diverse and inclusive culture can be very important. I think particularly, the pandemic really brought some of these things to a head where, I think many boards were dealing with human capital issues in a way that they truly never had before in literally every meeting, whether that was the employee health and safety issues that came up at the start of the pandemic, the issues that sort of created the the Great Resignation in the middle of the pandemic, or the mental health issues that sort of started to come to a head towards the, I guess, I don't know if we can call it the end of the pandemic, but most recently. And I think that boards are engaging more and more on these human capital issues, among one of which is diversity and inclusion. And, I think there's also good reasons for boards to lean in on this, which is there's enough data out there that says a diverse workforce, a diverse leadership team produces better results, whether that's profitability or growth or what have you. So it's not inconsistent or out of the remit of the board to be saying, how do we maximize our profits? How do we maximize our growth? And as a part of that, how do we create an equitable workforce?
I think it's really interesting sort of listening that the aspiration is definitely there. The good intent is actually there. But, Aubrey, what do you think about, that those aspirations need to be translated into actions and, tangible, evidential, actions on behalf of the company. Do you see that happening? I mean, where is the sort of positive message here for us on the diversity and inclusion part?
Yeah, I would say that some companies are getting it right, but most companies are wasting money on unconscious bias training, if we're being honest. So remember that is a legal cover your ass exercise and not an actual something that leads to systemic change. I would say that there's a lot of good messaging around ESG or diversity, equity, and inclusion in general, but often what we see is that corporate leaders don't have the courage to do the self-examination that's necessary to really create systemic change. Now, that is changing, and I think one of the things that makes me most excited is that we're seeing workforces that are demanding more. And while we're probably hearing that most from Gen Z as they come into the workforce, the fact is that the workers are demanding better working conditions. And I think in many cases, we talk about the Great Resignation, we talk about the tight talent markets, at least with the companies that I work with. And I think that this is actually creating a fundamental shift in the way that companies need to invest in their workforces. And so what we're going to see is, frankly, businesses that don't invest in creating equitable and fair workplaces. I think, as Lisa said, there's obvious financial benefits. There's also just a moral obligation here. But what we're going to see is you're going to see higher rates of attrition, which is incredibly expensive. And so what I would argue is that if you're not investing in diversity and inclusion, and that's structural remedies, auditing your performance processes, auditing your pay, running anti-racism training for your leaders so they stop perpetuating white supremacy. Those are the type of things that actually move the needle. And I'm really excited for the moment that we decide that a failure on diversity and inclusion is a shirking of the fiduciary duty to shareholders. And I think we're starting to get there.
That's really positive. I'm just going to put a couple of your points to Magda here and see what she thinks about it. Lack of courage from leadership and a generational divide. Do you see that as the biggest sort of hurdle right now again to achieve true diversity and inclusion?
I totally agree. I think lack of courage, and would even say outright resistance, is still holding us back and limiting progress in terms of diversity, inclusion, and getting into a more equitable and balanced representation at board levels, at industry levels. We need to not only bring diverse people on board to improve our statistics, but listen to them. And we are still far from that. So it's part of organizational performance to make sure that your organization, your industry actually represents your business, and you bring on board your workforce that represents the markets that you are conquering. If your buyers are not seeing your industry reflecting who they are, increasingly we are seeing people calling out these enterprises that are not bringing inclusion, diversity to the fore, so that we could move forward. I think it will take time. Mindset is one of the most challenging things to change. I heard just now, there is a lot of investment in unconscious bias, but that's not enough. I think there is a political indifference People, the board of directors in many cases think it is enough to bring in some few different people to consider that we are getting the marks, but that is not enough.
I mean, it's really interesting that we get straight to the problem around sort of organizational transformation and the structure of organizations. Lisa, if I could come to you on this point, I mean, your corporation is the largest governance, risk and compliance SaaS provider. And I mean, as part of that, your main role is to kind of look at how organizations are transforming themselves. I mean, what do they need to do so that diversity is at the core of their operations?
Sure. You know, as you say, we see a lot of this because we have over 17,000 boards that you know, we work with on a day-to-day basis. And just again, a couple of statistics to layer in. We just recently did a global study of directors with Spencer Stewart and specifically looking at board oversight and ESG oversight of matters. And we found that most boards handle it on a full board level. And I think part of the reason for that is ESG itself is so diverse. You know, it's climate, it's water, it's recyclability, it's care of your employees and culture, it's diversity and inclusion, it's leadership, it's some of the statistics that Magda brought up around you know, hiring, firing, promotions, and the makeup of the workforce. So it is an incredibly broad issue. I will say that since the pandemic began, the number of boards that report talking about this at every single board meeting has tripled. So boards are increasingly engaged in ESG matters, and the number of boards that say they don't talk about it or they rarely talk about it has dropped to 4%. And my question, you know, when I saw that statistic was like, who are these 4%? How can you possibly get through a board meeting or a series of board meetings without it, you know, kind of engaging on some of these issues, because they are so core to how a company operates. And you know, for the reasons that if I, you know, just supporting what Magda said about particularly around the workforce. So if you look at you know, there's been just to hit you with more statistics, you know, Deloitte does a study every year of the millennials, and they recently added Gen Z, because I guess, you know, you know, got to get to the latest cohort, and the Gen Z respondents were very clear that 49% said that they would work for, and in fact had made decisions around working for and choosing the type of work at the companies they work for based on their values. And that statistic was in the low 40s for millennials. So if you think about 40 to 50% of your workforce is not going to engage or do their best work or even show up to work at your company if you are not on the right side of history on some of these things, then that starts to make it much more tangible in terms of how you recruit a workforce. And then, you know, the other point that Magda said that I want to just highlight again is our employees are you know, need to be diverse, because our customers are not you know, one big monolithic thing. And so if you think about how do you have a workforce that can represent your customer base best, then the diversity issue starts to really play in. So, you know, I think many boards are very much paying attention to this issue. That you know, aside from that 4%, we'll find out who they are, and for good reasons, for the reasons because it's the right thing to do, and for reasons because it is the right thing to do for business.
I mean, Serpil, it's, you know, I've been working in the sort of diversity and inclusion, you know, as part of my work for a really long time. And I always feel like, you know, we hit a certain level where it's like, it's all going great. We think we're on a path, and then there's the step backwards. And now it feels like actually the step backwards is no longer acceptable. So we have to kind of move forward. But at the same time, its progress is really slow on so many ways. And there's the danger of virtue signaling, which sort of Aubrey touched on. I mean, what is it that will make this not just a discussion point, but an action? And is regulations, I mean, do you know, governments have to step in here to regulate, to really push companies towards getting to the right place?
Well, first of all, I think the companies need to approach this topic of diversity and inclusion, not just as I would say, an internal HR topic, but we need to take it really as broader in the sense that we need to redefine the value creation whereby social objectives and the business objectives of the company are very aligned. And we need to really look at this as also doing good business. And I think, the stats are all there where we have, more diverse and inclusive leadership ratios, the companies perform better. And also, as Lisa also pointed out, we need to really represent the customer base that we are serving. And I think, when you look at our sector, the technology sector, we are one of the ones, admittedly, that is lagging behind. And today in Europe, nearly only 1/5 of the digital jobs are taken by women. And more worryingly, women do not see a career in the technology and digital sector. And this is mainly because the industry has been quite, let's face it, male dominant. And a couple of years ago, we have done a research in more than 10 countries with 8,000 participants, where we asked a simple question. If technology were a person, how would that person be? Describe it to us. And not surprisingly, the answers came, that would be a male, middle class, white, person. And so this really shows that the perception of the industry is actually not diverse at all either. And we have been doing a lot of work. I mean, starting with Vodafone, we have been looking at what are those points of time in a woman's career where they face disadvantages. So it's not about basically giving a preferential treatment. It's about removing those barriers through tangible policies so that every person, every individual can have equal chance to excel in their career. And women admittedly have a lot of, points in time in their lives, starting with the maternity, but also later on, child care, elderly care, which causes them long breaks in their careers. So they face difficulty coming back to the workforce. So we have been launching initiatives starting with maternal policy years ago, paternal, but also a project called Reconnect, which is really inviting those women that have been on long career breaks. And but also we started looking into some issues that they face at home. So this is why we launched the domestic violence policy to support, unfortunately, the victims who have been increasing in the last years through the pandemic as well. And also policies like menopause policy. And these are things, that really help the woman's life so that they can really be productive at work and they can get the support of the companies. I really think that we need to do it. And of course, setting commitments with ESG in the board, having targets are important. But as I said, it needs to be a holistic company initiative where everybody really works towards it, not just one department of the company.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about the sort of tech industry. I mean, Aubrey, you left academia to move into the tech industry to make some changes. I mean, what was the driving force for you to kind of enter into that space of, that everyone looks at as a white male?
Yeah, so I'll be totally honest. I left academia because as a Latina woman, I felt super alienated and I did not know that tech was the same way. So a little bit of naivete, but it made me angry enough that I decided to try to fix it myself. And I think, for folks on the line, we probably all have a personal story about, the marginalization that we faced and the way that it galvanized us to create change. And I think that's probably the story that I would want to pull through on this, is that every single person has some kind of marginalization in their life. And so maybe if you're on the more privileged end of the spectrum, I consider myself as a white assumed woman, straight assumed, right? I've got lots of invisible marginalizations, but also a lot of privileges that come along with that. That's helped me to understand where I can use my privilege and my advantage to create change. And I think that's the exercise that we can all engage in. So it doesn't mean, or what I like to say is, people say, how did you get a DEI job? And I say, every job is a DEI job if you choose to look at your actions and your decisions through a lens of structural equity. And so that's the one thing I would say is, like, we each have a story of how we became passionate or care about it, but we should really take that passion and then hold ourselves accountable to creating change. And sometimes that looks like folks on the line of really pushing for this in our day jobs or taking on that formal role. But I think even more importantly, not to denigrate the work that my brilliant peers in this field do, but in so many ways, the people who don't wear the formal DEI hat are actually the ones that should be, but have the power to create change. And so that's what I would love to see.
Yeah, so we talked about tech. Moving on to health, Magda. I mean, the sort of gender gap in health leadership is quite well documented now, and we're starting to see more and more sort of data and evidence of the work that still needs to be done. Why do you think that health is another sort of problem area when it comes to diversity?
Well, as you know, medicine is traditionally a man field, just like IT is today a man field. Medicine was for too long a man field, so it took a long time before women could start aspiring to rise to positions of leadership. I will give you an example. In Canada, the first women dean of a faculty of medicine was appointed in 1999. So that's just last year. Despite the fact that we have seen change in terms of students entering the health schools and profession and in outnumbering men, we still have a long pipeline of young professionals and even older professionals in the nurse, in the midwifery, and even doctors waiting for, or probably not waiting, but I would say not hopeful to move into senior leadership positions. This happens in the global governance architecture, decision-making positions. It happens in research institutions, in academia, in healthcare, in big hospitals, small hospitals. All those healthcare or health-related institutions have problems of a huge pipeline of women who don't aspire or don't have access to senior leadership positions. This is because the discrimination is such, the role models based on masculine leadership roles are such, and the work conditions are such that women find it difficult to aspire, or those who aspire be allowed and given the opportunity because of the discrimination that exists in the workplace. We are increasingly demanding better working conditions that take care of the specificities of women. Women cannot have it all, your work-life balance or your career. You need to make a choice. It doesn't have to be like that, but it's still a long way to go for us to change that. The last report on the European Gender Index indicates that if we continue at this pace, it will take 3 generations before we can get a gender balanced world, or at least a gender balanced Europe, let alone a low and middle income countries. So there are 3 fundamental issues we really need to work on. It's sexual harassment in the workplace, which is also a fundamental cause of women being discouraged from aspiring to advance their careers and access leadership positions. We need to work on discrimination. And when I talk about discrimination here, it's not just gender related, it's race related, it's ethnicity related, it's disability related. So we need to work on this and make sure that the workplace policies are right. We need a decent social contract for women so that they can aspire to get into leadership positions. More importantly, men lead to lean out and allow the women in the pipeline to rise to positions of leadership.
I mean, when we talk about women in leadership in sort of traditional business sense, you know, like Serpil and Lisa sort of pointed out to, you know, all the evidence suggests that having a more diverse leadership team will increase revenue, increase profits, you know, better decision making. I mean, in health, it is critical that, you know, that the decisions being made in the right way. And we've seen data where, you know, tests are mainly done on, you know, 6-foot men, you know, and how does that affect like women's health and, you know, the consequence of that. So I'm just sort of curious, do you think, you know, that the lack of women in leadership in the health industry is actually detrimental to how women's health is being treated generally?
100%. The health industry is 70% or more in some countries made up of women. So when you take decisions on the population's health without the intellectual capital of women, you are bound to be making decisions that don't take care of the needs of women. Data is there to prove that when women take decisions about health, not only it improves women's health, but it improves children's health, in nutrition, it improves overall health outcomes. The pandemic brought to light something that I think most people don't think about. For example, protective equipment were used for preventing infections from SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, are produced based on men's bodies model. And therefore, they don't fit women's bodies, exposing them to a higher risk of infection, and therefore not also taking care of their needs in terms of menstruation, menopause, etc., the curves and the forms of human bodies. Therefore, the PPEs are not simply fit for women. And we are working towards making sure that those who produce PPEs take care of this in order to protect women better. But it is proved, data is there to prove that when women are part of decision making, we have better health outcomes because indeed they are the majority of the population, number one. Number two, they are more conscious about family needs, children's needs, women's needs in terms of healthcare, and we have better outcomes when they are included in decision making.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we're sort of moving into an area, and I'm going to put Lisa a little bit on the spot here around risks. You know, when you're advising companies and when you're looking at risks, what do you see as the sort of primary risk when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think there's some very tangible risks around it, and I can't recall who talked about you know, the things around doing audits of the workforce around the equity in pay, increasingly you know, companies that cannot explain why you know, certain populations, whether that's underrepresented minorities or women, or other groups are you know, paid less for the same work. That's certainly just a very tangible risk that has begun to come to light. I think you know, more broadly, there from institutional investors, if you look at you know, the BlackRocks of the world, et cetera, who have increasingly sort of said we have this focus on ESG, and one of the things in there is the S, and how is your company handling diversity and inclusion issues, and if you have made these broad public statements, which, you know, many companies at this point have, then what are the tangible things that you are doing as an organization to get there? And what do the statistics say? So it is one thing for a company to have made the proclamations, you know, possibly even with, you know, perfectly great intent. But then what are the results coming out of that? And is the needle moving toward a more equitable workforce? You know, that's where sort of the rubber hits the road here. And, you know, we've discussed all the reasons why, you know, companies should just sort of organically want to do that, because there is opportunity in having a workforce that reflects your employees and your customers. But there is certainly also the risk that an institutional investor would say, I'm not really interested in putting more money into that stock because excuse me, what the company is saying and what the company is doing around this don't appear to be aligned. There's risks of, you know, it's more difficult to get debt in some cases. If some of the advisors to institutional investors, the ISSs and the Glass Lewis, come in and say, hey, this is not going in the right direction. So there's plenty of good reasons to do it on its own, but there is risk avoidance, certainly. And there's also reputational risk around you know, simply not, you know, not living up to what has become fairly common standards. And then, you know, I think the last thing, and you know, maybe the one more risk that is starting to emerge, it's emerged in a couple of places in the United States so far, is this risk of shareholder actions against companies that are not aligned on what they have said and what they have done. You know, whether that's sort of, there's been bro culture lawsuits, there have been, you know, shareholder actions taken against management teams that have not lived up to their diversity and inclusion statements with specific activities that have gone on at these companies. So, you know, I definitely think there is risk to not getting this right.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to Aubrey. I'm going to come back to you now because you talked about the courage of leadership, and what Lisa's kind of talking about here is that, you know, there's a little bit of a fear of acting in a way. You know, it's like moving forward because of, you know, there's fear of what could happen here. And just to, I mean, ask a simple question with a complicated answer here. What is a courageous leadership to you?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two facets to it, and maybe it's an extension of what Lisa was saying. But I think when I see a courageous leader, it's first they're willing to fail, but they're not willing to not try. And I think that's what we see is often say people, oh, I'm so worried about making a mistake. Well, the fact is, if you're not investing in diversity, equity, inclusion, you're already making a mistake because your workforce is being harmed. So I think that's part of it. And then I think the other aspect of courage is being willing to change who you are and how you show up to realize these things. So one of the things that we often see, and sort of speaking to what so many of us have talked about, is that there's performative, like bullshit heavy statements about we care about diversity and inclusion, or maybe we're willing to put a few more Black people on our careers page, but we're not willing to make sure that Black women are actually moved up the ranks. And the way that you do that is by fundamentally restructuring the way that businesses are run. And I think this is really important because when I teach about equitable design, which is this theory of change that's really grounded in this idea that systems produce the outcomes they were designed to. So if you see a bunch of guys named John and Peter at the top of the ladder, it was because your company was designed to produce that outcome. And so therefore, if you are in power, you should be accountable and you should own that you enabled that outcome. But the really great news about the theory of equitable design, or DEI, or whatever you want to call it, is that systems can be redesigned. And so again, going back to this idea that it is a conscious choice that we can make to do things differently. And so courageous leaders are not only those who are willing to try, but also those who are willing to not only imagine a better future, but to take their own action to bring it into being. And I don't want to say anything like that's easy to do. Courage is not easy, but it is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, Serpil, I can't imagine how often you must have found yourself in a room with a lot of men in your industry, and where you had to turn up in a sort of certain way. Are you seeing any of those traits kind of coming to the fore, where people are turning up differently, checking their privileges a little bit before they go in, and genuinely listening to you, for example, when you come in with ideas and thoughts, and that are perhaps different to what the system was designed to listen to?
Yeah, so I definitely was not what the system was designed to listen to. And even though in many ways, you know, I'm almost always the only Latina in the room, for example, I actually do see in the last 5 to 10 years, the fact that I'm taken more seriously, or people who are even further marginalized to me, I do see our voices being listened to more. Like I said, I still think there's generally a pretty big gap between people who say they care and people who take action to actualize that intention. But I do see a shift happening. That said, I don't see it happening evenly. And so one thing that makes me optimistic is that there are companies that will get this right. They will get the best talent. They will be the businesses that thrive. And so I don't necessarily think we need to expect every business to be good at that. We're perfectly willing to let the dinosaurs go.
Serpil, do you agree? Does any of that mirror your experience?
I certainly see a big difference. And the difference comes from, first of all, having this conversation in the boardroom, in the executive committee, having metrics around that, and really everybody really working on solving this issue. And I just come back to one point, which makes me optimistic for the tech industry, is that recently, we have decided to launch a collaboration platform. It's called Change the Face. And this is an initiative actually we have started at Vodafone, following that research, which was saying if technology were a man. And we asked basically companies to make a pledge. And this pledge was special because we asked the leaders in the tech companies to make a personal pledge. And I give a lot of importance, actually, men pledging than women pledging. I would like to see more conversations around men about diversity and inclusion than women, honestly. And so this pledge campaign was received more than 300 pledges. And then I started hosting some conversations with the leaders in the tech sector. And now we have decided to launch an alliance, which is called Change the Face. And this goes beyond companies. This goes across the sector, across the industry, but also welcoming the NGOs, the academicians into a platform where we're putting all of our learnings and all of our best practices and also failures to really kind of collaborate and accelerate on diversity and inclusion. This kind of initiatives, I don't think we would be able to launch, back when I was beginning my career, because diversity and inclusion was not in the topic. And you're right, I was one of the few CEOs, entering into the meetings. So this is changing, and I'm really optimistic about it, but it needs to be men and women having this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Allyship is incredibly important. In the few minutes we have left, I've been so encouraged by the optimism that you've all brought here. That there's hope yet, and things are happening. But I want to ask each one of you, kind of, what is the one thing that you would like to see if you had a magic wand? And I know these are always difficult questions, but I think that they're important given all your expertise. So Magda, if I could come to you first, if there was one thing that you could do in your industry that you really think would make a difference, what would that be?
What will make a difference really is education. I think the new generation, the younger generation, needs to be brought up differently. We will only see significant change and definite change if we invest in education of the younger people and we transform the systems. Like Aubrey said, it's the systems that produce outcomes. If we don't change the systems, we will not see different results. So to me, changing the mindset is about educating the people. We need to remove the mental barriers that prevent people from accepting that we can be different, we are different, but women and people from different geographies have something good to bring to your industry, contribute to your success. And the world has become such a small place where really it doesn't matter where people come from. What is the more important is the intellectual capital that the person brings to your industry. To me, the key for a better world, a more balanced world, is going to be education. We need to create opportunities for people to get educated in a different way. And that's, to me, the key lever for changing the situation.
Thank you. Lisa, what would make your year?
I guess I'll go with sort of where my lens of expertise is at the board of directors level. I think it's incredibly important that change is reflected at the top, that we model the way that we want our companies to look. There's lots of data that shows that it's good to add a woman, 2 women, but really there's sort of magic that happens at 3 women, where the inclusion part kicks in, the voices are raised, and the participation level goes up. So I would like to see leadership teams and management teams and boards of directors better reflect the employee base, the customer base, and society in general, the community. So I think that's certainly one of the ones at the top of my list, and has far-reaching implications for everything from how strategy and risk are handled, which I think ESG issues should be baked into every company's strategic planning function. It should not be a separate thing. Someone said earlier, it's not one person's job, it's all of our jobs. And when it is baked into the fabric of the business, that's when really it becomes not somebody else's job. It just becomes something that we all do.
Yeah, I think that this point that you make about 3 women make a difference. We've almost been sort of programmed to think that there's a finite space for women at the table, and we have to get out of that that sort of mindset, because there shouldn't be. So Serpil, I'll come to you next. Where do you want to end the year? What would you like to see happen before Christmas in the tech world?
While working in the tech industry, my purpose is to close the digital divide between women and men, and also between underrepresented groups around the world. Today, unfortunately, there is a big gender divide in terms of access to even basic mobile phones. And then, also, of course, in terms of access to internet. So we're talking today that how an amplifier access to digital information is. It can really close the gap also in terms of giving education, because now we have connected education capabilities, and we're doing that many projects in Africa with refugee camps as well, giving instant schools. But this will only happen if this digital divide is closed, and this is what I'm really focused on in terms of tangibly delivering on that.
Thank you. Aubrey, you have the final word.
Oh, all right. This is easy. I would love to see corporate programs that focus more explicitly on anti-racism and tackling anti-Blackness in the workplace. So what we often see is that DEI programs focus on gender equity, which ends up engaging in a project that I like to call corporate white feminism, which helps white women, straight, white, economically privileged women get ahead, but it leaves behind the rest of us. And what I've seen is that when companies engage in fighting racism first, they end up building a system that actually works better for everyone.
Great. That was a very good way to end what has been a very enlightening conversation. I think what I sort of take away from everything you're saying is that there's still quite a way to go before we will reach sort of full equity. But I am grateful for all of your optimism that we'll get there, and from the practical advice that you've just given everyone around how to do that. I think that being a positive voice in it and having tangible kind of pathways towards equity is exactly the way to go. I am also adding material on equitable design to my reading list. I hadn't heard that before. So I want to thank all of you for bringing such enthusiasm and energy to the conversation, and your insight into such different sectors has been really, really valuable. So Lisa, Serpil, Aubrey, Magda, thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.